Hapai te Māori o te whenua, hapai te Māori o te wai, hapai te Māori o te tangata. When we build the life force of land and water, the people will thrive. Tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai, haere mai, ki tēnei hui of Aotearoa Circle, mō te kaupapa, the Tourism Adaptation Roadmap launch. Nā mihi mahana ki a koutou katoa I tēnei ata. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Welcome everyone to today's webinar. I have the pleasure of opening and also starting our today's webinar with our karakia. So if everyone can join me with the opening karakia, me inoi tātou, he karakia. Ka taka te hau ki te uri, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā tara tara ki tai. Kia hi aki ana te atakura, he tio, he hoka, he hūhanga. Tihei, mauri ora. Kia ora, ko Larissa Cooney toku ingoa, ko ati hau nui a paparangi toku iwi. I'm Larissa Cooney. My iwi connections back to the Wanganui River, and I am a guardian for Aotearoa Circle. And I would like to acknowledge my fellow guardians who are also in attendance today, Volker, Izzy, David and Penny, and also our Circle CEO, Vicky Watson. The other hat that I hold today that's very relevant is I share the co-chair hat with Penny Nelson and Takmutu for the Tourism Adaptation Roadmap Mahi. And I would also like to acknowledge some of our leadership group and technical group members who are in attendance today. We have Les Morgan, Joe Allison, Anthony Thompson, Rebecca Ingham, and also MB representatives. Welcome, ngā mihi, kia koutou katoa. A big thank you to three organisations who have made this mahi and this piece of work come together. And that is MB, Aotearoa Circle, and our Secretariat, PwC, and ei taku mihi, kia koutou katoa. We launched this piece of, we've decided to launch this work in two parts. The first part was the sector scenarios, which we'll hear from about today as well, a summary of those. And we launched those at the Tourism Policy School down in Queenstown in March. And the part two of the launch is the roadmap, which we will hear about today. This adaptation roadmap fits into a bigger piece of work for the tourism sector, the Tourism Industry Transformation Plan, the ITP for the environment, which is supported by MB and led by a leadership group that represents the tourism sector. The ITP have three pillars of focus. The first pillar of focus is reducing tourism's carbon emissions. So that's all around reducing the carbon emissions and mitigations around those for the tourism sector. The second pillar of focus is harnessing our tourism sector to help restore biodiversity in our ecosystems. And the third pillar of work, which is what we'll hear about today, is the tourism sector climate scenarios and adaptation roadmap. We started this mahi about 12 months ago, and it has become very obvious in the last 12 months how important this work is in light of the recent significant and devastating climate events that we've seen in this period. An outline for today's webinar. Shortly, you will hear from my fellow co-chair, Penny Nelson, and then Annabelle Charters, who is with our PwC secretary and a partner there, will provide an overview of the climate scenarios that we launched last month. And then Jack Keys from Aotearoa Circle will walk us through the adaptation roadmap, and he will also pick up the facilitation of the Q&A session that we will do after that. So I would like to ask anyone, if you have got questions as we walk through, please enter those in the chat box and Jack will pick those up and we can address those towards the second half of the webinar. So welcome everyone. I now have the pleasure of passing on to my co-chair, Penny Nelson, who's our CEO for the Department of Conservation. Over to you, Penny.
Kia ora tātou, Penny Nelson, toka ingoa. I'm delighted to be here today to represent the Department of Conservation, and it's really important to me that we're at this table. And the reason for that is it's really critical that the public and private sectors are coming together to protect nature. So many people don't realise that DOC is a key player in the tourism landscape. So while our core role is to protect birds, wildlife and our special places, we're also one of New Zealand's largest providers of visitor assets. We provide more toilets, tracks, picnic areas, huts and campsites than anyone else. We also manage nearly 15,000 kilometres of track. That's more kilometres than there are in state highways in New Zealand, and more than 950 huts. These assets are used every day for tourism by New Zealanders and international visitors. The importance of nature can't be overstated when it comes to tourism in New Zealand. International tourists spent nearly $2 billion in the past year. And we know from Tourism New Zealand's Insights research put out in March that beautiful landscapes and scenery are the single biggest reason why people come and visit New Zealand. 80% of New Zealanders visit public conservation land at least once a year. And when people visit our national parks or hike our tracks, they spend money in regional economies, at supermarkets, and on accommodation, transport, and activities. Half of all international visitors to New Zealand visit a national park, and those who do spend more money than those who don't. So while New Zealand trades on its clean green image, nature's in trouble, and extreme weather events are creating even more pressure. Climate change is having a huge impact on DOC's visitor assets. So the most recent and vivid example is from Cyclone Gabrielle in February. DOC received more than 550 reports of damage, more than 240 tracks, 17 campgrounds, and 28 structures were damaged, including bridges, stairs, boardwalks, and walls. Repairing the damage is expected to cost an estimated $66 million. More frequent and severe weather events are costing economies millions of dollars. Insurance companies are looking more closely at natural solutions to reduce the impact of events and therefore the costs. I'd really like to encourage all tourism businesses to plan for the future and use the climate change scenarios. Be proactive to help reduce the scale of the challenge we face. The roadmap is important. It will help build resilience into nature and our economy. Shows tangible actions that you can take between now and 2030 to make a difference. The roadmap supports you to develop transition plans. I also urge you to learn about nature-based disclosures so that businesses and company directors identify the nature-related risks that could affect their companies ahead of time. Go and digest the excellent legal opinion by Chapman Tripp released in March. If we all understand what government agencies need to do to adapt to climate change and what businesses need to do, we can reduce the impact. It's a win-win for business and conservation. So in closing, Cyclone Gabrielle has reinforced for me that we need to get serious about the best way to deliver services and build assets that are enduring and more sustainable. Biodiversity and climate change go hand in hand, so do tourism and conservation. The scenarios and roadmaps are tools to help us, but it's just the start. We need you to tell us, those of us in government agencies, what you think. Tell us where the sticking points are, what are the roadblocks or barriers that you're encountering along the way. So let's keep having this conversation and turn it into action. Thank you. I'll now hand through to Annabelle.
Thanks, Penny, and kia ora, everyone. I'm hoping you can now see some slides on the screen. Just by way of introduction, I am a partner at PwC and lead the Sustainability and Climate Change practice. What we'll go through in the next 10 minutes or so is a little bit of background to the project and the work that we have been through that hopefully supports and reinforces Penny's call to action in terms of adaptation for the tourism sector. Jess, if we can go to the next slide. Just very quickly, it goes without saying that there are a huge number of risks that the sector is facing from climate change. And as Penny has very clearly articulated, these are not risks that we're facing in the future. These are happening now, and as a sector, you're already feeling the impacts of them. The environmental degradation that happens from climate events and more generally continues unabated because the tourism sector is so reliant on the natural environment that is going to cause increasing difficulties in terms of the attractiveness of New Zealand as a destination. And of course, we're facing into the fact that to get to New Zealand for international visitors, there is an emissions profile to consider, which has implications in terms of how people think about Aotearoa, New Zealand as a destination. At the same time, New Zealand is known for its resilience, and without question, the sector is as well. And so the opportunities that both climate change and any disruption to the sector faces creates an opportunity to explore how things could be done differently, how the sector might innovate, how it might build resilience in the face of these changes that are coming. So this work has two elements to it. It was to develop first an understanding of the risks that climate change might present to the sector, and with that to develop some climate change scenarios, so understandings of how different climate scenarios could impact the sector in the future, depending on how much and to what degree the temperature changes. That work has been developed also to align with the External Reporting Board's mandatory climate-related disclosure regime. The second part of that was to develop the adaptation roadmap that Penny has referred to. And the intention is that in developing that resilience and thinking about adaptation, that the implications of those scenarios are taken into account in the planning and the ideas and the actions that need to happen. So as part of this work, we progressed with three different phases. First, we worked with a huge range of participants across the sector to define the risks that the sector might face and to develop those climate scenarios that I just mentioned. The development of the scenarios enabled us then to highlight the challenges that the sector faces, but also to identify the opportunities that are available that are to respond to those challenges in the future and to look at new opportunities as well. And then the outcome of that is the report that is, of course, being released today, which has both the climate scenarios in full and the adaptation roadmap for the sector. In terms of how this work progressed, it was very much a collaborative effort, led very, very strongly by our three co-chairs, Larissa Cooney, Tak Mutu, and Penny herself, and then a very, very strong and capable leadership group that reflects the breadth and depth of the sector. The intent of this was to get as many views as possible and ensure that we were considering every aspect of the tourism value chain, and all those, both from the public and private sector, who could be impacted or who had an interest or a role to play in thinking both about the implications of climate change and the adaptive challenges and opportunities that needed to be considered. We also had a much broader, what we call a technical working group that sat as another input into the work we've done. So the faces that you see on the screen and the organisations that were represented were then ably supported by an even larger group who is outlined in detail in the report itself. Just very briefly, from a project perspective, as I mentioned before, we went through a climate risk assessment, developed the scenario analysis, and then as part of that work, looked at impact, consequences, and challenges that linked into the opportunities and then the development of the roadmap itself. And now to the climate scenarios. So as the first part of this work, as I said, we looked at risks. And when we think about climate risk, we look at it from two perspectives. Physical risk, which is the risks that arise from how the climate might change. So those are chronic risks, so things like rising sea levels, more extreme high heat days, or acute, which is extreme weather events. So things like storms, flooding, cyclones that we've been experiencing. We also look at transition risks, which are risks that are categorized as arising from the process of not only New Zealand, but the world as a whole transitioning to a low carbon or zero carbon economy. And these can take the form of regulatory risks, customer risks, market considerations, and technology considerations. From a physical risk perspective, the group identified 4 key risks as being the major risks that the sector is going to face or is facing now. Now, these come both for the transition and physical risks from a much longer list of risks, but these 4 that you see on the screen are the ones that were identified as the key ones. That inability to maintain Aotearoa as an attractive destination, fundamental to the health and well-being of the tourism sector, goes without saying. Loss of species and biodiversity as a result of climate change, directly linked to that first risk of Aotearoa being an attractive destination. Inability to access attractions and locations. We've already seen, and Penny outlined this as well, with every weather event that happens in New Zealand, it puts out of action or creates disruption in our ability to access those key tourist destinations and attractions that are fundamental to the sector. And then linked to that, of course, is that's resulting in a reduction in operating days and opportunities. Whether it's because things are destroyed or there is a disruption to accessing or an inability to access some of those attractions. From a transition risk perspective, the 4 key risks that were identified included thinking about the customer, who is coming to New Zealand and how do they view Aotearoa as an attractive destination. With that, an increase in the regulatory drivers that could put cost pressure on tourism operators in New Zealand, on visitors themselves, and further across the value chain. As climate change is causing changes in how we do things, whether it be in terms of how we access destinations from a logistics or transport perspective, or some other reason, there is a risk that the tourism sector itself can't keep up with that rate of change. And then similarly linked with that, an inability for operators to be able to actually function from a commercial or a financial viability perspective. It may just get too expensive to be a tourism operator, whether that's because you have to anticipate a response to climate events, or just because there aren't the visitors coming to the attractions, or for some other reason. When we looked at the scenarios themselves, we developed 3 climate scenarios, a disorderly, orderly, and a hothouse scenario. We'll go through those in a bit more detail on the next slide, but just very briefly, when we think about disorderly climate scenarios, there is generally a high physical risk and a high transition risk situation. When we consider an orderly climate scenario, we're likely to have lower transition risks and also lower physical risks, which would be the best outcome for us. And then in a hothouse scenario, high physical risk and lower transition risks. Okay, next slide. So these are the scenarios. I appreciate this is an incredibly busy slide, so I'll try and draw out the highlights. There is, of course, all of this detail and more in the report itself. Just very briefly, when we look at the orderly transition, that is assuming and hoping that we get to net zero by 2050. When that happens, the expectation is that the implications from physical climatic events are going to be less, but there's probably likely to be more regulation and change in the near to midterm that enables us to keep those temperatures down. In this world, as we built out the scenario, we see the tourism sector flourishing. We see a tourism sector that has a very strong resilience and has taken a really regenerative approach to how business operates that is driving a really prosperous sector for New Zealand. We also considered, given aviation is such a key element within the tourism value chain, that under this scenario, the aviation sector has been largely decarbonised. And so from an emissions perspective, that's contributing to getting to net zero by 2050. Under the disorderly scenario, there is an expectation that we get to net zero by 2050 as well, but we do so in a bit more of a chaotic fashion. So as a result, we act slower, we feel the effects of of changes in the climate, but we do get it under control. The problem is that it's a much more costly and disruptive transition. And so we might have a few more years, both as a country and as a sector, where we don't feel the implications from a transition perspective in terms of regulatory changes, but then they are likely to hit much sooner, with much more force rather, around 2030 and beyond, which could be much more difficult to manage when they start to come through. With that, under the disorderly scenario, there is inevitably increasing costs for the tourism sector as a result. And then if for any businesses or parts of the value chain that are really emissions intensive, things become a lot more difficult under this scenario once we get into 2030 and beyond. And then finally, under the hothouse scenario, this is a world where we essentially thumb our nose at climate change and we don't do anything. So nothing changes. From a physical perspective under this scenario, we are going to experience the most extreme implications of climate change. And for the tourism sector, that of course has a huge, creates huge issues in terms of more and more extreme weather events, disruptions to transport, degradation of the natural environment as a result, and travel is likely to be both more difficult and more expensive. So not where we want to land as a country or as a sector. Just to bring that to life a little bit, this is what it looks like in terms of looking at a few key headline statements. So you'll see across that in all of them, temperature increases. That goes without saying, but we are hoping that we can keep it under control under the orderly scenario. The reason for the increase in population and why that increases with the more severe scenarios is due to climate refugees. So there is a general belief that while we will certainly suffer from climate change, as does the rest of the world, there are places elsewhere on the planet that will be suffering more, and we are likely to see an increase in our population here as a result. In terms of the carbon price, some of you may be wondering why it's so low under the hothouse scenario. That's because we don't do anything. So there is not a cost of carbon, and there is not the market levers that are encouraging emissions reductions. And so we're seeing fossil fuel use continue unabated. And no price for carbon that is incentivizing behavior any other way. You can see the rises in sea level continue to happen, and then certainly the tiles on the bottom as you move across the page, those extreme heat days increase quite considerably under the disorderly and the hothouse scenarios, as does the extreme rainfall. But without question, we are facing into those changes even under an orderly scenario as well. Just very quickly, as we are all very much aware, what we do in New Zealand is very much a very, very small piece of a much broader global issue that we're facing into. And so when we think about this work, we think about it in the context of both the global data and insights that have formed some inputs into this work. And we also think about how that can be made relevant to a New Zealand context. So as we've outlined, this work has been very sector focused. There is still a need for organisations to think about the specific risks, scenario analysis and adaptive requirements that need to take place. But we hope that the work and the outputs of this project provide a really good tool for you to be able to translate that into your own businesses. Next slide, yes. And then finally, just to wrap up, in terms of when we think about the climate scenarios, while it's certainly incredibly useful if you do have mandatory disclosure requirements under the External Reporting Board's standard, this is also incredibly useful for you to think about how you might respond in terms of strategic decision making, how you might think about the opportunities that climate change presents, but also how you can prepare and adapt to ensure that you've got really strong and enduring business models to progress ahead with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annabelle, and kia ora koutou. Ko Karangahaki te maunga, ko Aotearoa, ko Pairoa taku haukainga no Manawatu me Ingarangi o Kutipuna and noho ana o e tamaki makoto and naine ko Jack Keys aho. If you're all feeling a little bit scared, worried and concerned about the future after Annabelle's presentation, I don't blame you because I am too. Thank you very much, Annabelle and the PwC team. Taking us through those climate scenarios and starting to get a bit of a look at reality of what the future could look like really starts hitting home when you put some numbers and scenarios and situations behind it. So for those of you who haven't seen it yet, as Annabelle has mentioned, the Climate Scenarios Report is out and available, and will also be attached to this roadmap, which I'm going to take you through next. So Jack Keys, my role is a Director of Implementation at the Aotearoa Circle, and I have the pleasure of leading both our agri-food and our tourism work streams. And I'll be taking us through for the second half of this session. So I'll spend the next 15 minutes giving you an overview of the adaptation roadmap. And that's really important because after we've seen what the future may or will hold, and now we're going to talk about, well, what are we going to do about it as a sector, and what's the sector saying that it needs? We'll then try and leave at least kind of 10 minutes for the Q&A, So please do put any questions in the chat. And I've made sure I'm facilitating the Q&A so I can answer the easy questions and I can get Larissa and Annabelle to answer all the difficult ones. But for now, let's get into this content and make sure we leave some time for it. On this first slide here, I just wanted to set the scene for the roadmap before we get right into the content. And what's important to emphasize here is when you see the roadmap in its short form here or in the final report, the actions that are in the roadmap are either going to sit in a gap that the industry and leaders of the industry recognized, or they're going to complement and bolster or accelerate existing activity. So we've avoided any direct duplication of things that are already happening, but it might be that there is links with existing activity where it's really important to put more emphasis behind that. On point 2, the roadmap also is not just going to talk about actions, but it talks about the impact or the outcomes of those actions so that all of you, the sector, our audience, can understand the real life implications and what we expect to happen when these actions are delivered. And thirdly, there's a bit of a balancing act where we've been looking to give enough detail to these actions that they do guide implementation and you can understand what the action means, but at the same time, not taking away the opportunity and the accountability for those that are going to lead and design the final implementation of the actions. And then also on this slide, I want to reiterate some of the comments from Annabelle and Larissa around the depth and breadth of the engagement that's happened across this work stream. So our acknowledgements page in the report almost had to be 2 pages because to fit everyone's names on it, there was not much room, from the algae and the TAG that were also actively involved to the government agencies, to our Aotearoa Māori advisory and other special advisory. There's a lot of people involved in this piece. And that's also really important because on that last point at the bottom of the slide, the tourism sector is pretty unique. There's huge regional diversity. There's such a big difference between different tourism subsectors. And so we wanted to make sure that we can represent the true diversity of the tourism sector in this work to the best of the ability that we could. So if we could go to the next slide, please. At the start of the presentation, Larissa's talked us through the 3 pillars of the ITP. But what I also want to re-emphasize is that the co-chairs, our leadership group, and many of those involved in the ITP have been really committed to working closely together so that it's not only that there's synergies and complementary writing and how these roadmaps and the pieces of work have been written, but also perhaps more importantly, how that collaboration works as we progress towards implementation. So these work streams will very much be connected moving forward. So here we've got a little bit of a picture of the roadmap on a slide. The roadmap has been split into 5 different regenerative pathways, and each one of those pathways, which is represented by a circle on the slide, we'll talk about the objectives, the action, the time horizon, and the key stakeholders. So I'm going to spend a few minutes going over each and particularly focusing on that objective, action, and outcome. But to frame all of this work, the leadership group and those involved have contributed a vision and a mission. And that vision is an abundant regenerative tourism sector that ensures people, planet, and prosperity are balanced. And that comes along with the mission to ensure our sector is resilient and reducing the impacts of climate change. So we pop to the next slide, we'll look at what is termed number 0. And I think that really reinforces the urgency and the fact that this action gives us the start line. So the objective is around developing a clear baseline, and that's so that we can identify the most at-risk regions and businesses so that action can be targeted where it's most needed. And this really provides a foundation for the remaining actions. And as with all of these actions I talk through, you'll see there's a lot more words in the actual action roadmap. And so this is just a high level summary. If we go to the next action. In this next series, there's actions that are really focused on gathering and leveraging data so that we can prioritize nature and biodiversity in the tourism sector. And that allows adaptation indicators, our climate change adaptation indicators, to be agreed upon, not just leveraging what's used internationally, but for a specific Aotearoa context. So we can then be able to measure, track, and report against climate change adaptation indicators so that we're really leveraging data in the way that it can be most impactful for tourism businesses right across the country. We go to the next slide, please. There's a lot of critical pieces on this one, a few more words on this slide, because this is where we talk about the planning and some of the bits and pieces of implementation of those that are going to be supporting implementation. So at the top there, we're looking at where we link with the previous action around data, how we then utilize that data, especially those adaptation indicators, to enable tourism businesses to create their transition plans. But also on this slide, it talks about the formation of the groups that will look at delivering on climate change adaptation. And in tourism, as we all know, there is many really valuable and critical pieces to the tourism sector, and there's a few different layers of organizations. So what the LG and the co-chairs and those involved decided is that a cross-pollination of kind of key representation across these different groups, centralized on the topic of climate change adaptation, is going to be the key way to deliver impact and action going forward. So what's discussed in the roadmap is a governance group, which is developed to set the purpose, the vision, and the expectations of an advisory body. And that advisory body is really key because that's essentially an activation group, which is responsible for tasks like developing the guidelines, tools, business cases for climate change adaptation, and some of the other actions in the roadmap. So the impact here is not only the development of the transition plans, but actually centralizing the guidance and the delivery of the action. So there's two more regenerative pathways. This next one, and you'll notice it's a common thread throughout this work, is coming back to how data is leveraged, but in this situation, and it connects with the delivery of the work by that action group, is number one, looking at education programs and how they can be developed and delivered to still match the diversity of the sector. So important there was not just that there's going to be some 70-page reports for every tourism business to try and read, comprehend, understand, and interpret and deliver, but instead that there'd be tailored online content for those where it's most suitable to be distributed that way, that there'd be in-person opportunity for extension services and also tailored multi-business extension programs. Then what's also in here is the creation of those climate data toolkits. And at the final point there around integrating with industry groups and health and safety measures, there's already a lot going on for the tourism sector. There's already a lot of things on the to-do list and considerations that need to be done. So rather than, despite its significant importance, just adding another layer, understanding there's an opportunity to integrate a lot of this work with existing activity to actually bolster it itself and put in some efficiencies for the businesses. So linking with industry group collaboration for areas such as the health and safety and recovery plans. And finally, directed investment. And so financing and resourcing this work is obviously crucial to the delivery. And some of the important areas here are around delivering a business case that outlines the costs of adaptation and the importance of regenerative sector investment, and also understanding opportunity for regulatory and policy incentives that are able to enable investment. What you'll see in this part of the action plan is, rather than relying on setting up new funds or requiring money to appear to support the tourism sector, the leadership group decided that there's two areas that are most important. One is seeking to leverage existing funding mechanisms and make sure that they're fit for purpose and targeted towards climate change adaptation. But then secondly is understanding how you can enable kind of discounted access to capital through existing mechanisms like through our major banks, and using things like green loans or other forms of climate change adaptation funding, which are currently available but still not quite fit for purpose, and being able to access capital through those really scalable forms of investment. Now that is the roadmap at a glance. That takes us through the 5 areas. And so the last slide here is to talk to you about what's happening next. So really key is initiating the implementation. And that's not only the Aotearoa Circle and those actions that we'll look to pick up and lead alongside the tourism sector, but those that will be picked up by industry and government. And in particular, on that second point there, the establishment of those critical bodies. And so I mentioned that there's time horizons in the roadmap. And so as you'll see, many of them are labeled as the immediate priorities, and those are the ones that will be picked up after our launch, which we'll be really looking forward to continuing this excellent collaboration that's happened across the sector for the delivery of the work. So that's the roadmap. I've seen there's a couple of pieces popping up in the chat. So I'm going to ask if we can bring onto the screen our panelists for some Q&A. We have left enough time for at least 10 minutes of Q&A, which I think is excellent. And so I'm going to just quickly look through these questions and see which ones we'll pass along to the group. So one of the questions from Jennifer, and I'm not sure if you've already been able to see it, Larissa, Annabelle and Penny, but is what is meant by abundant and regenerative in the tourism vision, and how do these terms relate to the social foundation and planetary boundaries of donor economics, for instance. And I know that there is some in the roadmap, it's actually explains a couple of those terms rather than just sitting them there, but great opportunity to talk to that on this call. So Larissa, I see you've come off mute.
Yeah, I'll pick that one up. Thanks, Jack, because it's a key part of the ITP mahi as well. So I do want to define the term abundant, because initially that could look like mass tourism numbers and over tourism and overcrowding. That is not what this definition of abundant is. When we refer to the term abundance, it is about having our needs met as we need them to be met. So it's more about flow as opposed to accumulation or taking more than we need. That aligns very nicely to, I've seen what Simon's put a comment in here around the destination management approach. So a number of our RTOs, regional tourism operators, have adopted a destination management strategy and approach, which is all about more flow, making sure that our environment, our community are at the core of our offering, and also ensuring that we have the right visitors at the right time. So you'll see in the report that we've tied that quite nicely to explain what we mean by abundance. And then in terms of regenerative tourism, there's this thesis and PhDs written on this concept, but we have explained it quite nicely in the report. But what I like to say in just one sentence to sort of put it back and have it relatable is that it's all about leaving our environment and the communities better than we found them. So that's sort of the underlying concept there. It aligns very nicely to what Penny talked about earlier with the Task Force for Nature-Based Disclosures. And at the heart of that is the businesses that connect in with nature and have a reliance on nature and use nature, ensuring that going forward they have a positive ecological biodiversity impact. And that's what is at the one of the key foundations of a regenerative approach, that when we have that engagement with the tourism and visitors, that we're leaving our environment and our people better than we found.
Thank you very much, Larissa. There's a few more questions coming in, which is excellent. And a couple of them are getting into some more detail. So I'll keep them open for the moment rather than targeting them to anyone. The question here from Heidi is that I fully support a data evidence-driven approach, but curious to know the thoughts on the mechanism or responsibility for aggregating and reporting data. So I understand in the roadmap, like I mentioned at the start, that balance between not going all the way to delivering the exact final solution, but also trying to give a direction of what needs to happen. Not sure if any of you on the panel want to talk us through, initial thoughts on where you think that action could and should head. And I guess there's a link there with the Tourism Data Leadership Group as well.
Okay, I'll jump in. It's a tricky one. We've had many conversations on this in both work streams because it's going to be a whole different sort of set of data that we're looking for here, right? You know, in the past, data for the tourism sector has been focused on tourism numbers and economic data, whereas here going forward, we'll be looking for biodiversity data. You know, how is the environment being left better? Back to my original comment, and we like to use the concept of MODI, which from a TR perspective is the life force of the environment, the life force in the community, and going, you know, so you're looking at it quite differently. You know, how are we measuring? How can we measure the MODI of our environment and those people, and the impact tourism has on that, to ensure that to the whakatauki that I opened with, Hapai Te Mauri o Te Whenua, the MODI of the environment is uplifted, and therefore the MODI of the people is uplifted. So we have had discussions with the tourism governance group around believing that we need to lean into a different sort of way of measurements, coming up with different ways of measuring our impact on the environment, the community. We think the MODI meter is a concept that can be used, a return on regeneration metric. You know, you have return on capital, different metrics, and it's going to require us to look at things a little bit differently and find ways to gather this data. We're looking globally as well to see what's happening in the space.
Thanks, Larissa. Was there something you wanted to add to that one, Penny?
Yes, I do. So I think there's a really key role for government in the data space as well. So the natural resource sector within government is really having a close look at what would we need to do to get clearer data standards and make it easier to share environmental data. And DOC and Land Information New Zealand in their recent long-term insights briefing, you know, talk to that. And as emerging technologies are coming through, like eDNA, which enables you to quite quickly be able to see the impact on the environment more quickly, that it'll be even more important to do that. So I think that there's a really key role for government in that piece.
Jack, just a very brief comment from me as well. Just another work stream that we're progressing with the circle around the task force and nature-related financial disclosures. The question around data, that aggregation piece and the reporting piece and accessibility of the data is coming through very loudly and strongly. We don't have a solution, but that is certainly something that is part of the work we're looking at in that project as well.
Yeah, thanks, Annabelle. And while you've got the mic, there's a couple questions in here that we'll get to next around the plausibility and the challenge around alternative fuels. But firstly, I just, before we finish today, I think it would be useful if you could mention some of the key considerations for those tourism businesses that are online in the audience today, about what should they be looking at when they leave this webinar and looking at using the climate scenarios as a tool. What are the kind of key steps or key considerations for them next? And that gives Larissa and Penny some time to look at the more challenging question, which we'll go do next.
Okay, sure, Jack. There is certainly a lot of information to digest, and we recognise that this has been a very long and involved project. I hope that in terms of taking away from both this webinar and then the report itself, there is information that starts to build a broader picture of some of the changes that could happen to Aotearoa as climate change takes its hold in far greater form. For businesses, in terms of thinking about this in the context of their business, it's being aware of the action that you need, the actions you need to start thinking about now. So climate change might not be affecting your business or how you operate today, but it's just being aware and anticipating how you might need to adapt in the future, and knowing that as part of this work, and both the work that Larissa has mentioned around the ITP, there are activities, actions, there is a groundswell of support and acknowledgement that change needs to happen, and being linked into that and that awareness of these climate issues and how they might impact your business is the most important thing you could take away. You might not feel the need to act today, but understanding that these things are going to happen is really, really key, and building them into your thinking around how it might impact your business is going to be really, really important in terms of I suppose, the long-term survival of your business.
Thanks, Annabelle. That's brilliant. And so we've got a couple of, I'm interpreting them as relatively similar questions here from Emma, talking about given the lack of viable decarbonisation options for aviation, is it plausible to assume that it could be achieved under the Woodley scenario? And what actions do we need to drive that change? We've also got a comment from James around the plausibility of actually maintaining a thriving international tourism sector at all in a 1.5 degree world, let alone the other scenarios, with alternative fuels being a long way off. And yeah, is that actually implausible? So there might be a couple of you want to pick up some comments in relation to those questions.
So Jack, I'll kick off with that. It was definitely one of the most significant challenges for this group and for the ITP to think through. I just want to note that it was not part of the sort of mandate for this group because they were focused on the adaptation roadmap side and the scenarios, but it is one of, as I mentioned earlier, the key pillar, a very strong key pillar for the ITP, the tourism ITP for the environment, is on decarbonising the tourism sector, and we understand that a huge component of that is decarbonising the transport system. So that's not only aviation, cruise, but on road in New Zealand as well, domestic and international. And so you'll see more work come out of the ITP. We will be launching the roadmap 16th of June next month, and that will be available, and then we'll be going out for public consultation for that for over a month. The other role that I chair is the chair of ITP, the co-chair there, so we'll be out and about sharing what's come out of that, acknowledging that there's a big bite of the elephant to take there with decarbonising aviation, but there is a roadmap that has been looked at there, and clearly we've been working with a number of aviation, notably here in New Zealand, and understanding their plans with sustainable aviation fuel. So I encourage people to join and read the ITP roadmap as it comes out, and also participate in the consultation process.
Thanks very much, Larissa. Was there anything that you wanted to add to that, Annabelle, or in terms of that, particularly the plausibility of the scenarios as they were developed?
Sure, and it's a really good thing to pick up on and reiterate. You know, these scenarios, they are not prescriptive. They are not crystal ball gazing in terms of saying this is the future of New Zealand. They are a way of thinking what might happen or could happen, and the implications of that on the sector specifically. Having said that, we're all, as I said at the beginning, I think as both Penny and Larissa have also said, we are already experiencing the impacts of climate change. So in terms of using the scenarios and thinking about them and tying that back to solutions like the decarbonisation of the aviation sector that's required to move us to one scenario or another. That is one of many levers that could get us to, say, an orderly scenario. Some of these are within the sector's control, some of them are well outside of it, in terms of particularly with biofuels, for example, where we require I suppose international momentum and scale to achieve outcomes that are going to also benefit New Zealand. Which is probably another thing to mention and remember, because it comes up quite a lot. The climate in New Zealand, as I said, is connected to the rest of the globe. And so while we can do our bit to reduce emissions, and we can do our bit to try and do right by climate change, obviously what happens internationally is going to affect our climate as well. That's why the adaptation piece becomes so important. So you have the flexibility within your business to survive whatever comes, irrespective of the actions we take in being good climate citizens. And so that's why being aware of how you might flex, how you might think differently about what you do and how you do it, and then how you do that in a regenerative manner that actually supports the restoration and regeneration of our biodiversity is really key.
Thank you, Annabelle. And we're coming up to our last few minutes, so I'll come to Penny just for any final comments, and then I'll look to close the session. So Penny, just in terms of any final reflections on those last few questions, or just in terms of the connection between DOC and this work moving forwards, if there's anything you'd like to share before we finish up?
I think all I'd like to say is I think it's really useful to practically think about the scenarios in your own business. So we've started doing that at DOC, and even if they're not right, it gets you thinking about what you might need to do differently. So we've, for example, started to think about what it might mean for things like the hump bridge, what it means for particular species under different scenarios, and it was really confronting. But for our leadership team, it's good to be starting to think ahead. So even if they, don't turn out to be accurate and perfect, I really encourage you to engage and get going. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Penny. And I know there's a couple of questions that we didn't get to in the chat, but we will look to capture those questions and get back to anyone that we haven't got to yet, or feel free to please reach out. But I'll take this opportunity to say thank you for all of you being on the panel for the Q&A. And on behalf of the Aotearoa Circle, I guess we're here to share this challenge, but also these opportunities with you. And so a really big thank you to you all for joining in the session, acknowledging, recognizing and appreciating your time and commitment to join us and listen in. And please do reach out if you'd like to connect with any of the next stages of the work around the implementation, or if you have questions to what we've gone through today or with the roadmap. I'm going to close the session now with a final karakia on behalf of Larissa, and then all welcome to leave, but thank you very much again for joining us. So tukua te wairua mana e whakahau manu, e whakaora te rerehua e Aotearoa mō ngā uri whakaheke. He arataki I a mātou mahi me tā mātou. Whainga mātua ki a hono ai ira tangata ki te taia. Toia mai, rā te kaha me te ngākau ponokia. Hutu tahi a tātou ki ngā awha arahi kia ora. Ake tiao tū kupu. Kia poipoia mō ake tonu atu. Whakamaua ki a tina huie tai kie.
Tai kie.
Thank you, everyone. All the best for the rest of your day.